With me in the studio, Dan Perry is an international affairs analyst and a former Middle East editor of Associated Press. Great to have you with us, Dan, and I'm sure you can give us a bit more context on this. It started out as an operation to bring peace to the Galilee. We just heard Herzog allude there to what life was like in the Galilee with these constant attacks from across the border in Lebanon. It turned into a quagmire pretty much, didn't it?
It certainly did, because when you think about the Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War, the issue is not just the 1982 invasion, but the fact that beginning with 84, when they pulled out from most of the territory, they stayed in a security zone that became a genuine quagmire, and that lasted for 18 years, achieved nothing. And if it has any legacy at all, it was the creation of Hezbollah that accompanied it, the involvement of Iran in dominating Lebanon, and a problem that persists to this day, whereby Hezbollah is now the enemy from the north, and Hezbollah exceeds the PLO in magnitudes of damage it can cause Israel and rocket arsenal and so forth by a tremendous gap.
And some analysts say that Israel really overestimated the capacities of the Lebanese population there, who were friendly towards Israel, and really underestimated the Shia population.
Israel thought that they could create Christian hegemony in Lebanon, and Christians were once the majority. And indeed, when France left Lebanon, they had a chance to have a smaller country where they would be a permanent majority. They unwisely did not choose that route. By the time Israel got involved, they were already a minority, and Israel tried to make sure they ran Lebanon. That backfired rather spectacularly.
Would you say this was Israel's one and only failed attempt at regime change?
It was, and it taught Israel a lesson. It's very difficult to interfere in another country's affairs unless they're willing to pay a bigger price than Israel ultimately proved willing to pay. And
Israel did pay a big price, of course. Hundreds of soldiers lost their lives in that conflict. Yes. And Israel at the time was, of course, the dominant military power.
It probably strengthened Iran in the region. Remember when Israel invaded Lebanon, the Islamic Republic was only a few years old. It wasn't clear that they were going to become the monster that they are today. It probably encouraged them to do that by trying to play God in Lebanon. There were three goals. One was to end the rockets. The other was to kick out the PLO. That becomes a slightly less defensible, especially when considering the 10 years hence they invited them into the West Bank and Gaza. And a third was to change the nature of politics in Lebanon. That proved completely unattainable and backfired, as I say, spectacularly.
So take us back then, prior to the conflict. What was life like in the Galilee region of Israel then, in northern Israel?
Well, what people forget is that the first Lebanon War was in a way kind of the second Lebanon War, because there was also a smaller invasion called the Litani operation, smaller scale, run by Defense Minister Ezer Weizmann at the time, 3 or 4 years before, which also didn't achieve the aims. Fundamentally, every few months, there were salvos of rockets fired by the PLO from what was called Fatah land, because the PLO controlled what eventually became the Israeli security zone, the area just across the border from Israel. Begin used that, some would say, as a pretext to invade Lebanon, because he was feeling some pressure from having been too peaceable in giving up the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt just a few years before in the peace treaty.
Right, of course, all wars are kind of informed by what happened previously, aren't they?
Now, the official narrative, and I don't discount it entirely, was that they were aiming to put an end to the rockets, but honestly, I remember at the time there was a very strong feeling they were looking for a pretext. And by the way, the ultimate pretext was the attempted assassination of Ambassador Argov in London.
In London, right.
Yeah,
and that was cited as a kind of a casus belli for going to war.
Like the next day or the day after, they immediately rolled into Lebanon. They were obviously looking for an excuse. But the rockets from Lebanon were not a trivial thing. Of course, very sadly, for the past 4 decades or so, Israel has been facing rockets from different directions as well. It's a problem that seems to dog Israel over the ages. And right now, the biggest threat comes from Lebanon and Hezbollah, backed by Iran. That's an enemy of an entirely different magnitude, and I'm afraid Israel poked the bear here and may live to regret it.
Do you think it was a mistake then? Do you think things could have been different today if that war wouldn't have happened?
Yeah. I think the current disaster in Lebanon didn't need to be quite this bad. I think the Iranian involvement in Lebanon didn't need to be. I know that's somewhat controversial positions. There are some academics that say Iran was planning to do so anyway. I don't really buy it. But primarily, the security zone in Lebanon, the occupation that lasted after the war and only ended in 2000, was an unmitigated catastrophe. Many, many hundreds of Israelis lost their lives. Much of southern Lebanon was rendered, dysfunctional. Hezbollah only strengthened from it and Israel lost tremendous political capital. I just see no benefit deriving from that other than, and this attaches to Israeli politics, saving face for the Likud. Likud simply refused to support a full pullout.
And we were talking about the difference between the first and the second Lebanese war. How would you characterize those differences?
Well, both have weirdly, differently mixed legacies. The first Lebanon war succeeded in ending the rockets for a while and kicking out the PLO. It had the unintended consequence of helping Hezbollah come to a rise, which became, I think, a far more dangerous enemy, creating generations of genuine enemies in Lebanon who remember being bombed by Israel, and Israel has no real desire to make an enemy of Lebanon. And of course the 18-year quagmire being stuck in the buffer zone, which I characterized as pretty useless and highly ill-advised. The second Lebanon war was post-Israel's withdrawal from the buffer zone in 2000. It happened in 2006. Again, Hezbollah was proving to be pesky and a threat and so forth. And that war is extremely unpopular in Israel for reasons which I at least find slightly mystifying. I mean, sure, it was mishandled in a variety of ways, and it also exposed some weaknesses in the IDF in terms of training and weaponry and other things. But the fact is,
there was a high level of casualties on the other side. A lot of Lebanese civilians lost their lives in that war.
Sadly, I don't think that's why it's so unpopular in Israel. I wish I could say it is, but the main thing in Israel is that it's perceived as a failure, whereas the reality is that for 16 years there's been silence on the border of Lebanon and no rockets fired across the border at all, and Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, has been largely in a bunker. So if the goal of that operation was to bring peace to the Galilee, as the first one was named, it manifestly has succeeded, despite the image of having been a failure. I think largely it attaches to Ehud Olmert, who was unpopular and, of course, was drummed out of office and ended up in jail.
Right. And I wonder what people think victory in Lebanon would look like, indeed. Would people prefer Hezbollah to be wiped out altogether?
Yeah, victory in Lebanon would be that Lebanon agrees to be a friendly country, as Israel would like to be towards Lebanon as well, and that Lebanon ceases to be a territory that is essentially lawless and from which an armed gang supported by Iran is able to establish an arsenal of thousands of rockets aimed at Tel Aviv. Lebanon should cease to be a danger. That is what Israel would like to have happen in Lebanon.
And it's hard not to see the contrast between Israel and Lebanon. Here is Israel, with a thriving economy, a high-tech sector, making new friends in the region, of course, via the Abraham Accords. Lebanon currently in the grips of the worst economic crisis in history.
It's a genuine tragedy. Lebanon is a dysfunctional state. It's a failed state. It has tremendous potential, obviously, but it has done the opposite of realizing that potential. It could be argued that if it acquiesced to Israel and stopped being an enemy of Israel, Israel in its delight would be so generous and would extend such a helping hand that it would benefit them. But I'm not so sure that the 60 to 70% of Lebanon that is Shiites and Sunnis and Druze would play along.
Do you ever foresee that happening then? Can you see any situation where there might be peace between Israel and Lebanon, and what might bring that about?
How long do you have? I mean, peace maybe not in our time, but eventually yes, because at the end of the day, Israel and Lebanon have no territorial dispute. Lebanon is, for an Arab country, relatively westernized. It has a very large sector of the population that is mercantile and practical-oriented and highly westernized and even French-speaking. It's conceivable.
Yeah, and of course we've seen the French President Emmanuel Macron visiting several times, trying to kind of see the situation there as well.